Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Nelson, Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts here at the National Gallery of Art. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 28th Annual Sidney J. Friedberg Lecture on Italian Art, featuring Dr. Keith Sciarbas, Professor and Head of the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Malta. The Friedberg Lectures began in 1997, and they are named after the great specialist of Italian art, Sidney J. Friedberg, who lived from 1914 to 1997, and he was a longtime professor of art history at Harvard University. He was also chief curator here at the National Gallery from 1983 to 1988. We are grateful to Dr. Catherine Friedberg, whose generosity has made this important series possible, and I am pleased that she is with us today. I would also like to welcome the Ambassador of Malta to the United States, Dr. Godfrey Sharib and his wife, Dr. Kay Sharib, who are with us today as well. I also want to point out, this is where we understand how small the world is, that Dr. Sharib and Dr. Sciarbas are distant cousins, and they haven't seen each other in a minute or two, so this is what happens at the National Gallery. So let's introduce our speaker. Dr. Sciarbas is a specialist on Caravaggio, Roman Baroque sculpture, and Italian Baroque painting. In addition to his role at the University of Malta's Department of Art and Art History, he is a member of the Senate and the Rector's Delegate for the university's historical buildings. He has curated several exhibitions, including the Malta Pavilion for the Venice Biennale in 2022. His teaching and research explore the central place of Malta in the discourses and development of Italian and Roman Baroque painting and sculpture. Central to this goal is Dr. Sciarbas' most recent publication, the 2023 book, Art as Life, Caravaggio in Malta. The culmination of many years of research on Caravaggio's Maltese phase, Dr. Sciarbas explores the role that Malta played in elevating Caravaggio's work more broadly. Art as Life rigorously contextualizes Caravaggio's work and his life in Malta within the mechanics of patronage and the particularity of Malta's governmental system at that time. Dr. Sciarbas engages with Caravaggio's Maltese paintings, presenting them not only as objects of visual delight or seduction, but also as conveyors of meanings and experiences that engage with the self and the consciousness of reality. The oratory of the Dell'Equilibrio in Valletta, for example, ceased to be a dormant architectural space once Caravaggio's beheading of St. John the Baptist was installed. With the painting's presence, Dr. Sciarbas stresses the space's ability to deeply affect people's mental frameworks, thoughts, and emotions, blurring the boundaries between object and viewer, and understanding that the work's power was not only visual, but also effective in many other ways. We are honored to have Dr. Sciarbas with us today. I would like to thank everyone who made today's lecture possible, particularly Center staff Kyra Cabañas, Associate Deans for Academic Programs and Publishing, Gary Calcagno, and Jen Rakowski. I also appreciate the support of our colleagues in the Audiovisual Department and Visitor Experience. And without any further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Keith Sciarbas to the lectern. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm very honored to be here. So I've got some words of thanks. Is it clear? Can you hear me? Good. Well, I should start first and foremost by thanking Dr. Kaywan Feldman, Director of the National Gallery, for the interesting conversations that we had almost 2 years ago in front of Caravaggio's paintings in Valletta, conversations that eventually led to the formulation of the main argument of this talk. Well, I am obviously very much indebted to the center, to the dean, Steve Nelson, to Kyra Cabañas, and to all those who made this possible, especially Gary, who was very generous with me over the past months. We all our word of thanks to Dr. Catherine Friedberg for keeping with so much love and passion the memory of Professor Friedberg alive. Thank you for this. Well, during the preparation of this lecture, I sought the advice of many, but kindly allow me to thank and underline the thoroughness of the feedback that I got from Professor Sharon Kino. Well, I must also underline the kindness of my partner, Anna, who's here, whose insights and discipline poured so much ice on my otherwise very warm-blooded take on Caravaggio. This I greatly appreciate, so you're going to have a much colder version of the story. That's all due to Anna. I was warned that it should not be longer than an hour. It's 58 minutes long. Okay, we're going dark. Thank you. So, when Caravaggio left Malta in June 1607, protected but still a fugitive from papal Rome, he boarded a galley of the Knights of St. John. The galley squadron was under the command of his childhood friend, Fabrizio Sforza Colonna. Their destination was the island of Malta, small and rather isolated, situated at the Catholic frontier of the central Mediterranean. Its connection was the sea, but this was the sea of battles between the Catholics and the Ottoman Empire. Archival research shows us that at one point during Caravaggio's voyage, and let's just think that we're on the galley and you're all Caravaggio, when the galley squadron was beyond the shores of Sicily, there was real concern for engagement with the so-called enemy. News was it that 8 enemy vessels were waiting for them outside Valletta. The Grand Master could see them very clearly from his palace tower. We all know this through the archives. We have the letters. At that stage, all men on board the squadron, including Caravaggio, were asked to be armed and ready for the fight. Well, for some reason, the engagement that the letters between the Grand Master of the Knights, Alf de Vignacourt, and the general, Fabrizio Sforza Colonna, claimed to be so imminent, it seemed as though it was about to happen, never materialized. Instead, the galleys disappeared, the Ottoman galleys disappeared, and the squadron on which Caravaggio was sailed very smoothly into the harbor of Malta. Well, this is how Caravaggio's Maltese story started. Caravaggio moved to a context that was different from Naples or Rome, different from those he knew previously, straight into a context of frontier. This we cannot ignore in our assessment of the artworks that we will discuss. So, for those of you who have never been to Malta, let me transport you to Valletta and to the main church built by the Knights of Malta, the co-cathedral dedicated to St. John the Baptist in the city. When you enter the church, there is on the right side, beyond the first bay, an oratory that, like a wing, extends from the main church. This is the oratory of the Decollato, the beheaded one, which was built between 1602 and 1607. It was high, bare, and austere, unadorned, having its blank walls defining what looked like, or what looks like, a box-like structure. The facade that we see here was clad in the 18th century, but the structure is all original. So now let's go inside. We've opened the double doors. for you to see directly on the main central axis and at eye level the prostrate figure of St. John the Baptist, held down by his executioner. Painted for the end wall of the oratory, the humanity and immediacy of this imagery pulls the viewer into the oratory, where a potent exchange between the artwork and its audience begins. It is as the viewer moves closer to the figure of John that a cut at his throat and the spilling of the blood unveils. Well, these interactions and dynamics are the subject of today's talk. The picture under review, as you all know, is Caravaggio's beheading of St. John the Baptist, executed in Malta in 1608 for the Knights of St. John. This is what you are looking at, and we've been very careful to match the size, okay? So this is the real size of the work. The narrative of the martyrdom of St. John the Baptist, set within the grand geometric space of a Maltese courtyard, is stripped to its bare essentials. It features 5 protagonists placed in a closely knit arched group on the frontal plane. The Baptist is on the ground. The executioner holds him firmly. The master of the jails instructs on where to place the severed head. Salome leans over with the platter in her hands, and an old lady holds her hands to her face in anguish. On the right-hand side, in the background, set within the confines of the prison, 2 convicts seem to intently watch the grisly scene. The figures, apart from the Baptist, all wear contemporary dress. The scene is stark and devoid of iconographic elements. Well, this painting is one of the most celebrated of Caravaggio's works, and perhaps one of the most discussed and widely published of his final altar paintings. Here I can mention the work of many scholars throughout the decades, of Roberto Longhi, John Azzopardi, Mina Gregori, John Spike, Helen Langdon, David Stone, and many others. Well, this lecture will engage with this picture as a conveyor of meanings and experience. As Helen Langdon put it, and I quote, Caravaggio put the religious scene back into a real context, into the context of the everyday, renewing immediacy, recreating meaning, end quote. Well, this lecture will also discuss how Caravaggio performed what today we would call studies of audience immersion before deciding on the line of sight, scale, and perspective. How Caravaggio often employed these devices in his Roman paintings has been very well studied. However, we might think of the Maltese beheading as one that most captures his exploration of these devices. That's the ceremony on the feast day of John the Baptist. And that's the bishop over there. Well, over the past years, my own work on Caravaggio's final years has concentrated more on sensory engagements, after years focusing on the contextual, archival, and technical character of his paintings. Well, archival research, and this is the Commissio Criminalis for Caravaggio, Frater Michelangelo, was what dominated the first 30 years of my work. Well, precisely because contextuality was sorely missing in the study of Caravaggio's Malta. Human interaction, that is, how Caravaggio pushed the boundaries of audience immersion, how he turned painted vero and imaginary space into part of the life world, how he reacted to the transformative action of natural light, how he gave greater space to silence, are important to me now. This is, I quote, that total authenticity, that Sidney Friedberg wrote about in other contexts, the depths of feeling that emerge in the work of art. In mentioning scholars, I should also underline the seminal work of Michael Fried on absorption and immersion in Caravaggio's Rome, in a series of lectures that he delivered here some 20 years ago. In Caravaggio's Maltese painting, the relationship between the artwork and the viewer, a viewer that is specific to the historic moment when it was created, come to a head. Furthermore, movement as is performed by both audience and celebrants, play a significant role in the painting's logic, as it does in many other older paintings. We will see how the painting works with its audience, as the audience itself goes through the ritual motions of the ceremonies that take place in the oratory itself. This is the oratory of the Decollato. Immersion into this requires extensive contextual background and archival sources, not only on the oratory as a structure, but also on how the painting worked or functioned or performed in Caravaggio's time. Archival research has transported me to the builders, the commissioners, and the original users of the space. It has allowed me to understand the patrons and to engage with the artist from this perspective. It is my own immersion in the project of historical reconstruction that unlocked for me the audience immersion that we are discussing here. And to be more precise, how Caravaggio wanted his viewers to experience his work. As a side, and Steve mentioned this briefly, allow me to very proudly mention how through such immersive studies we engaged with contemporary art in the installation called Diplomazia Astuta that I curated with the artist Arcangelo Sassolino at the Venice Biennale of 2022. While Caravaggio essentially transforms his space into a space of human experience, one that penetrates into mental frameworks, thoughts, and emotions. We will see how the profundity of such exchanges blur the boundaries between object and viewer and strengthens what is called immersion. Well, in his installation, Arcangelo Sassolino explored the dimensions of Caravaggio's work in his own. In contextualizing Caravaggio's work within the specific function of the Maltese oratory, we must also frame it within Caravaggio's own life story. That is, his own investiture and dramatic expulsion as a Knight of Malta. We must discuss the mechanics of patronage of these knights. They were hospitaller knights, but they were essentially warriors. And also within their system, very peculiar system of government. Well, I wish to emphasize again that Valletta was not Rome, nor Naples. As we said in the very short introduction, the Mediterranean Sea was a battlefield, and the Maltese waters were part of it. Valletta was essentially a war machine. It was impressively fortified. The 17th century traveler Jean Dumont described it as follows, I quote, "He had traveled the world. I may venture to say, without hyperbole, that this is the strongest city in the world," end quote. As leader of the Knights of Malta, the Grand Master, the Frenchman Adolphe de Vignacourt, pictured here by Caravaggio, styled himself as the terror of the Ottomans. He was a warrior, as immortalized in Caravaggio's painting at the Louvre. The knights' military triumphs of the period, namely those at Maumetta, Nocastro, Lepanto, Petrasso, were celebrated, was their very humiliating defeats at Cimbalo and also at Maumetta, Hammamet meaning, were somehow turned into cause for admiration. The Grandmaster's imagery was marked by the words "Toti Oriente su essere formidando." The entire Orient thought that he was formidable. This was clearly anchored in the achievements of these years of his rule, between 1601 and 1607. That is precisely when Caravaggio set foot on the island. On the night side, contemporary stories of heroics and of dying for religion abounded. Within this context, it must be said that Caravaggio's beheading was made at a most basic level for a sacred space, a church. But on another level, as we shall see, it was made for warriors in both life and death. Caravaggio's beheading is political in nature, and perhaps his most political of the final works. Politics and religion in this context, however, are very intimately connected. It has often been discussed how the painting captured the order's own battleground agenda towards the immortalization of death, of suffering, and of martyrdom. The impact of enduring martyrdom for the cause, or by extension, death in battle, would have resounded in the oratory's hall. This was one of the last paintings that the warriors would see before going to board their galleys to engage their enemy. The painted space of the Baptist martyrdom extends to immerse the viewers, their individual and personal responses absorbed. The theological and frontline, we will discuss this, impact of Caravaggio's painting was great. The way to approach death by the order's warriors was to be modeled on the manner of the prophet, their patron saint. In its engaging realism and its naturalistic representation of physical corporeality, Caravaggio brilliantly summed up the context of the Counter-Reformation, of the spirit through which scenes of martyrdom brought Christian warriors face to face with huge representations of death, so that these warriors might learn not to fear it if they were prepared for it. In the modernity of this work, there is no ephemeral triumph, but one is brought face to face with the vero, with the real, with the cold-blooded representation of execution. It was by far the largest representation of an execution on the island of Malta. Needless to say, it was also the most realistic. Nobody in Malta had ever seen anything like it. Let's dialogue with the imagery. In theory, the act of dying for the Knights of Malta epitomized the knightly ideal of resurrection with Christ and of shedding one's blood for religion, the most charitable of deaths. In his picture, Caravaggio focused on the shedding of the blood that has started to spread and pool on the ground. It is where he places this action that is so pivotal for its experience. He places the blood exactly on the center line of the composition, but very low in the picture space and in the most frontal of planes. This works so very well when the picture is seen from the church nave. Why? Because distance and perspective work in such a way that the height and placing of the painting And this unexpectedly low focal point is situated exactly on the eye-level line of sight as soon as one enters the church. Well, we tried to make it function here, but it's obviously very difficult to capture when it is not viewed on sight. Well, artists and art history have for long spoken about meanings constituted as an experience for the audience of works of art. About resonance, how a work resonates with its audience, about the interaction between humans with the works of art and with the environment. Fried spoke about absorption and immersion, Baxendel about experience, Friedberg about authenticity. Johannes Belasma spoke on the sensory, Peter Zumthor on atmosphere, Stephen Greenblatt on resonance, and there's so many more. So let us explore such performative action. I try to be clever here, I'm not sure whether it works. Anyway, in Catholic ceremonial, one is expected to kneel at the door of a church on approaching the altar or during the celebration of rites. In doing so in the oratory, as one can see in the screen, perspective and line of sight works in such a way that as one kneels, the central and very low placement of the blood of John spilling from his throat seems to pour directly onto the tabernacle that is in front of it. Furthermore, perspective moves the figure of John as if the prostrate body of John is being lowered to lay on the altar's gridine, the gridine as the tomb of Christ, burial as an act of mercy. In this manner, as one can see in the slide, Caravaggio's compositional structure lowers the body of John, emphasizing the visual contact between the blood of John and the tabernacle that is placed exactly beneath it. For the knights who kneel at the altar, with this particular sightline, it would appear that the blood of the Baptist pours into the tabernacle that stores the Eucharist, the bread and wine, body and blood of Christ. In the painting, then, blood joins blood, hence the title of this lecture. Theologically, this movement of the Eucharist also affirmed how the blood of the precursor, John the Baptist, announced the Passion of Christ. Let's add another dimension. With calculated precision, the chalice of consecrated wine or the wafer elevated during the celebration of the Eucharist would also be in line with the same perspective and appear to gather the blood of the saint dripping from Caravaggio's picture. The blood of John joining the blood of Christ. Well, Caravaggio celebrated the martyr's blood, and thus also those of who, for Christians, was the greatest of all martyrs. Well, this slide shows it being performed on the feast day of John. And I remember one particular Monsignor Branco, telling me how he used to aim it so that he brings his wafer in line with the blood of John. Now this is wonderful because the movement of the audience and the relationship with the work is well known in collective memory, in local collective memory. It is known by the older priests and the sacristans. So this shows how ingrained these dynamics were. It also shows us that Caravaggio's painting was not just an image to be seen, but one to be felt in place, one to be experienced because of what it performed. Well, let us contextualize this experience even further by underlining how archival research has shown us that the early 17th century audience in the oratory of the Decollato was not the audience that we have today. It was not the general public, but it was a very exclusive and specific one. The conventual church of St. John the Baptist was not the church of the native Maltese, of the locals, of the residents, of the poor. They had their own churches. This was the privileged space of the knights, the non-native pan-European rulers. The oratory of the Decollato was an even more exclusive space because we've seen in the slide that it was almost a church within a church. It did not have a street entrance and was only accessible through the main church of the knights. The native Maltese would not get entrance to it unless they were at the service of the rulers. It was also a sepulchral space because it was built on this huge cavernous crypt. There are 2 layers of it. This is just beneath the oratory. The main cemetery of the knights and the exclusive place for their burial. It was a place where history, religion, art, and politics intertwined, and where meanings are infinite. The oratory was reserved for the knights' private devotion to the martyrdom of their patron saint. The knights kept the treasured relic of the hand of John, whose powers made it even more significant when exhibited on the altar on the day of his martyrdom. Remember, this was the relic of the right hand of John. The right hand is the hand that baptized Christ. So imagine going to battle, and before you go to battle, you are given a ring that was placed on the hand that baptized Christ. So it had these special powers, and these special powers performed in the church. The reliquary had been obtained by the knights as part of an exchange with the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid in 1484, when the knights were still in Rhodes. It was considered to be their most precious relic. Its exposition was reserved only for special circumstances and occasions. Caravaggio, of course, knew this, and he would have seen it. He dialogued with its exposition on the line of sight, on the blood, and with the blood of John. Significantly, the knights held another relic, and this was a little fragment of the cranium, of the head, or what was meant to be the head, of John the Baptist. The cranium of the beheaded was a relic that was exhibited in front of the blood that John painted. Well, the oratory had a number of functions, and the archives give us a number of details. Let's see one of them. In 1623, kneeling in the oratory, a Portuguese knight faced his trial. He heard his sentence being read out. He was found guilty of having murdered a fellow Portuguese knight. For this, he was sentenced to be deprived of his habit in yet another ceremony that also took place in the very same oratory. Once he was deprived of his habit, he was no longer a knight. He was then beheaded in a public square. The oratory was also, and very significantly, the Hall of Justice. This is where the knights held their trials for their own members. and where their members were condemned. It was not only a church, but their courtroom. The now widely published print from Osterhausen is the first that shows the beheading there. It shows such interaction in the oratory not as a church, but as a courtroom. The accused kneels on the central line in front of the altar, directly under Caravaggio's huge picture. So let's make him kneel over here. Well, my research has shown how such ceremonies were held in this space from the very onset of its construction. The archives have given us the names, the why and the when. It has given us the context of what happened when Caravaggio was there, when this hall was marked by the stark aura of military justice. Ironically, as we all know, it will be in this very same hall that Caravaggio himself will be tried in absentia and expelled. We will soon discuss what those who were being tried or punished would see and feel. The enormous canvas that Caravaggio painted dominated the room. How deeply this oratory was set within the ceremonials of justice is furthered by the fact that the oratory of the Decollato was entrusted to the Confraternita della Misericordia, a confraternity composed largely of warrior knights. We know their names, we know their status, we know how they funded their efforts to complete the building of the oratory, precisely when Caravaggio was about to sail to Malta. This confraternita, hence its name, was concerned with acts of mercy, misericordia. But, unlike the Neapolitan Piemonte della Misericordia, for whom Caravaggio had painted the Sette Opere della Misericordia, 7 acts of mercy, this confraternity was only concerned with 1 act of mercy, that is burial. And this, furthermore, was specific not to burial of Christians, but to burial of Catholic prisoners who had been condemned to death. What would they do in their final days? On the final days of these prisoners, they collected alms for their souls. And provided for their burial. The processions of this confraternita and the ceremonials prior to execution were the most poignant of events happening in the oratory in the early years of the 17th century. This is a photo of one of the last public executions held in Malta in the 19th century. And there is the confraternita, the members of the confraternita, walking the poor soul who's at the back towards the gallows. Well, the confraternita was part of the order's military hold over the island. We do not have 17th century diaries, but we have 18th century diaries that give us a picture, a wonderful, a macabre picture of what happened. I quote, "At 2:00 in the afternoon, the knight commanders of the order emerged from St. John's Church wearing black sackcloth with the insignia of their confraternity of St. John. They went around the city requesting alms for those who were about to be beheaded." End quote. Well, these rites were elaborate, and they lasted several days. The final ceremony or ceremonial took place within the oratory. the prisoners were taken inside. Then they were led out of the building to be executed, either hanged or beheaded on a public stage. The Confraternita would then perform the final act of their mercy and take care of the remains and proceed to bury them. There are diary records of prisoners on the death list being taken to see these executions in order to be prepared for their own, similar to what Caravaggio painted in his own picture. In turn, this was also found in the statutes. And there is the poor soul being buttato nel sacco, placed in a sack, to be dropped in the harbor of Malta, with the prisoners intently looking at what's happening. Well, archival research has shown this extraordinary proximity between Caravaggio and the Confraternita. Caravaggio surely heard stories or witnessed the processions with the soon-to-be dead in the oratory of the Decollato itself. In sum, he knew well that these prisoners were also to become the distressed audience of his great work, as if they were witnessing their own execution. Caravaggio states had seen the Malteseness of his architecture, the interaction that he created between real space and painted space, made it seem as though the viewer was physically and silently present in front of the platform of an execution. And this is exactly how you would see it in the oratory. I wish to repeat, for the poor condemned who would have been led into the oratory on its main axis and made to kneel there before being taken to their own execution, the impact of this huge painting, working directly on their perspective, and so naturally extending its reality to the condemned, must have been overwhelming. It would have seemed as if the end wall had dissolved. It was as if one was looking out into a shallow piazza in Valletta, from within the oratory itself, encapsulating the drama of being dragged out into the street and beheaded. Well, the oratory is a rarefied site, one of ceremonial and ritual and spirituality. And here, this space extends into a world that is its opposite. Caravaggio's work is no longer a painting. Contextually, archival research has shown us that the oratory of the Decollato was a multi-purpose hall. It was used for many other ceremonials. Let's discuss one of them. It was popularly known as the Oratorio dei Novizi, the oratory of the novices, the school room, the hall, the lecture hall, significantly placed on top of the martyrs, where the martyrs were buried. I always joke with my students, and I tell them, imagine that they bury me in lecture hall B, where I lecture. So they were symbolically taught or lectured over the remains of their heroes buried in the crypt that we have seen, but symbolically also in the place where they could be expelled. Once accepted for knighthood, Caravaggio himself became a novice, and this space therefore became his oratory. His interactions with this space must be kept in mind to fully grasp the original context of Caravaggio's work and what he had to take in before painting it. Let's see it again. Many have already commented that physically and logistically, the beheading is so large that Caravaggio must have painted it in the oratory, just like the depiction of a mural. There is no way that such a huge painting, the largest that he had painted, and the largest on the island at the time, could have been painted elsewhere in Valletta and then carried to its final place. For this reason, the argument for site specificity is even stronger. The oratory became Caravaggio's studio, a place that he worked in and got to know, precisely calculating the lines of sight and the distance and the perspective from within the main church, pacing up and down. This dictated the size and the scale of his figures, here 2 meters tall. Added to this, observing the ceremonies happening there, the location of the altar, the source of entry of light, and how it impacted on the audience's vision, he deliberately curated his narrative to perform accordingly. Light. This is a photo from 1970. Sacred spaces, as you all know, are often designed to engage with shifting daylight. Works of art within those spaces in turn may react to that light or to the ambience that it produces, often taking on a spiritual aura through the effect of light within that space. The discussion of Caravaggio's engagement with the evocative, ephemeral, and transformative power of natural light is very well known. In our case, the dynamics of audience experience in the oratory are multidimensional. The atmosphere, that what Zumthor calls atmosphere, meaning the changing parts and the intensity of natural light during the day, and the transformative qualities that light brings, acted on the painting. In other words, the passage of light brought it alive. Well, clearly this can't be experienced under static artificial lighting, or if the work is only be seen for a short time span. I tell my students, don't walk in and out. Just stay for an hour, 2 or 3, just to see the passage of light, just to see it transform, and to see light move around the work, and to see what Caravaggio does with that light. So let's focus on how natural light transformed and sacralized the space of the oratory. As you can see, light falls very sharply down from the left side, from a series of large clerestory windows on the upper wall. Of the side walls, it is only this wall that is punctured, because the other wall, as you can see over here, was a blank wall, because there was the prior's palace on that side. These windows bathed the main hall strongly and uniformly, with the light being directed through very steep beveling here, directly to the center line. This was clearly very well calculated by the architect of the oratory just a couple of years before Caravaggio's arrival there. Light intensity moves, its passage moves in this direction. It moves throughout the day, gradually to fall sharply from the central lantern over the end wall as the day proceeds. In the afternoon, the intensity of natural light becomes stronger over the altar, not on the side. Caravaggio's picture takes account of this, with light gliding down the executioner's arm when the sun is at its highest, as he deals the final blow to the martyred saint. The widely traveled American writer Boston-based writer and publisher, Mathurin Moray-Balou, in the late 19th century was very clearly impressed by this. He captured it in his Story of Malta that he published in the US in 1893. Suddenly, a strong ray of sunlight penetrated some opening from above and rested upon the illumined hangings. It brought out the dim colors and figures as though they had been touched by the wand of an enchanter. The eye involuntarily followed the shaft of light to its source, the rays being made up, apparently, of buoyant and infinitesimal sands of gold. The translucent column slowly changed its angle until it rested for a moment, like a halo, upon the severed head of John in Caravaggio's canvas, then suddenly disappeared. It seemed like an artificially produced theatrical effect, cleverly managed, but the memory of the singularly impressive experience is indelibly fixed upon the brain. Well, this is exactly what we're talking about, way beyond the invention of Caravaggio studies. He captures what the transformative quality of light is. Let us add yet another dimension, one which occurred during the rites celebrated in that space. Burning incense during ceremonials captures rays of light and clouds space, momentarily obfuscating images. Within the artery, in such circumstances, the figures in Caravaggio's narrative are the first to be obscured because they are placed in the immediate ground. This is really what happens, okay? When the figures vanish in the incense, the immediacy of the picture provides a dark void. This was by far the largest of Caravaggio's dark spaces. The vast emptiness of the canvas becomes a vehicle where one can better encounter the spiritual. Space and void, as we all know, was a mode to approach the voice of God. Moments later, at the climax of the ceremonial rite, with the clearing of the incense, the figures emerge out of the sheer darkness, as though they were being unveiled, with the ray of natural light perfectly matching that which Caravaggio painted. Let's add to this the chant and the music. Well, this naturally implies that a site-specific work, such as Caravaggio's Beheading, provides different sensory experiences throughout the day, and depending on the rites that were performed. It is clearly to me that the artist did not paint this, but he curated this. Physical and painted light are intertwined, with Caravaggio capturing a powerful reality brought about through his darkness and through his light. The boldness of the Beheading captures the same boldness of Caravaggio's final years, the reverberating essence of his spiritual path, and the passionate intensity of his persona. Its immersive character and forceful ability to penetrate into the spectator's mind is difficult to rival, at least in the paintings of the period south of Rome. In turn, the picture allows us to enter into the artist's mind. It clearly and decidedly affected the path of his own career and charted the way for his monumental Sicilian pictures, especially the burial of Lucy and the raising of Lazarus, or his most poignant of the last paintings, the much smaller but equally powerful Martyrdom of Saint Ursula. In terms of site-specific research, the present-day experience of the Beheading makes it stand apart from the other altar paintings of Caravaggio's final years. Why? Well, as you can see in the slide, very unfortunately, the Sicilian altar paintings are today not preserved in their original spatial context. The physical space of the raising of Lazarus and the Nativity have been completely lost during the earthquake that razed Messina to the ground in 1908, and are today presented rather cold-bloodedly in the museum. The burial of St. Lucy fortunately lies in its historic space, but very unfortunately, its physical space and the relationship with its audience has also been completely transformed. However, the compositional modes and structure of these two large Sicilian paintings have so much in common with the Maltese beheading that this engagement allows us for insights into how Caravaggio curated these Sicilian works in their original and now lost space. In a manner like few others, the beheading of St. John the Baptist also has a manifest autobiographical imprint, one now that immerses the artist now, not the audience, into his own picture. Let's now focus on this and move from audience immersion to the artist's immersion, to his personal response to a significant moment of his turbulent life. In many ways, through his picture, or pictures, Caravaggio was literally painting for his life. Very rarely discussed is Caravaggio's own ceremonial of his investiture. Receptio in fratrem militem obedienza pro Magistro Michelangelo de Caravaggio. Documents show that the oratory was also a space for the investiture of new knights, the main place for their trial and the main place for their expulsion. It is generally held, and there is no reason to doubt this, that the beheading was made as Caravaggio's passaggio, his passage money, his entrance money into the Order of St. John. In simple words, it was his payment for becoming a Knight of Malta. Late in February 1608, Grandmaster Wignacourt received news from the Pope, from Rome, that the Pope Paul V had essentially consented for Caravaggio to become a knight. At this stage, the Grand Master, I wish to assume, called for Caravaggio, and he asked him for this painting to be placed in the oratory. Consenting, Caravaggio, again, I wish to assume, probably replied, I will fill your wall. This will be the largest picture that I have ever painted. I will finish it before my own investiture, and I will sign it as a Knight of St. John, with the same red blood with which I will paint the blood of John. This was to become his own immersion into the work. The specifics of Caravaggio's own investiture as a Knight of Malta are not known, but it is only logical to assume that it was prepared to be in the oratory. Archives show us very clearly that from 1604 onwards, many investitures were held there. And archival research also tells us exactly what happens. What happens was clearly dictated by the statutes, and there is no reason to doubt that Caravaggio's investiture was any different. Now, during his investiture ceremony, wearing a long secular habit, Caravaggio would have approached the altar holding a burning torch. He would then kneel in front of it to follow the celebration of the Eucharist. admittance into the order began, with the candidate being reminded to honor the poor, exercise acts of mercy, cultivate obedience, and defend the Catholic Church. An interrogation followed. Questions were asked, focusing primarily on whether the candidate was prepared to follow the knight's statutory rules. There's a whole list of questions that were to be asked. Let me clarify at this point that manual work, mano d'opera, precluded a person from becoming a knight. I would presume that this was also the case for the honorific knighthood that Caravaggio was invested in. So to the question whether he had ever performed manual work, did you ever perform manual work? Caravaggio would have been expected to say no. Well, we need to contextualize this, because it is meaningful that Caravaggio would have thought in these terms. His painting, for his audience, was not the work of the hand, thus no, but the work of the mind. The interrogation was then concluded, and Caravaggio would solemnly pronounce his vote. He was then declared a new member, declared a warrior, a servant of the sick, and a defender of the Catholic Church. In one of the most symbolic moments of the ceremony, Caravaggio would then be invited to kiss the altar. And after doing so, he was given the black monastic habit with the 8-pointed cross being pointed out. He would have been told, "This is our cross, and we order you to wear it, always over your habit and your dress." Remember that this is the imagery of Caravaggio wearing the 8-pointed cross that Bellori captured. It is the imagery that became so iconic. Giovan Pietro Bellori immortalized him in his chivalric robes, and not in the daily robes that he would have worn, according to Bellori, until they were rags. In so many ways, Bellori's own imagery runs counter to his text and to his own conception of Caravaggio. So at this stage of the ceremony, the robe with the 8-pointed cross was placed close to the candidate's chest, to the left, so that the points of the cross touches the heart through the fabric. He would have then been told to press it hard until he felt his heart beat. These moments of culmination are what the ceremonial was all about. He should defend the cross, protect it in battle at any cost. He was also warned that should he flee or abandon his duties, he would duly be expelled and punished. If you retreat or abandon the standard of our religion, and if you escape from your battlegrounds, we will consider that you have violated your vote, and you will be deprived of this holy sign of the cross, and we will cast you out of our order like a putrid member. As he entered this new role as a Knight of Malta, this was also a baptism of sorts, a cleansing of his name, and a major step towards expunging him of his sins. He had sworn his allegiance to the ruling class and became a member of the ruling class, when in Italy it had never been the case. In many ways, the oratory of the Decollato and the beheading set the stage for Caravaggio's most prestigious social and worldly achievement. In many ways, Caravaggio created the impressive background for his own graduation. I tell my students, imagine that the dean or the director tells you to paint the background for your own graduation. He knew this very well and declared his new status as an artist knight. Significantly, this signature, Frater Michelangelo, crowned the most impressive moment of Caravaggio's final phase. Never before had the artist found it necessary to sign any of his works, but this painting and its context were what made the difference. This signature was not about his style. That needed no signature. It was about the artist's life. Hence, the title of my book, Art as Life. Once he knelt in front of the altar, his own name and the blood of John the Baptist on the line of sight would be tipped in the tabernacle, the blood of Christ. It was therefore the signature of a man who had regained his social status, redeemed himself, and was paving the way for his eventual return to Rome. This, as we all know, would never materialize. The words, "We will cast you out, ti vedrai schiacciato," must have sounded like a warning, foretelling what Caravaggio actually did, only a couple of weeks later. The brawl in Valletta in August 18, his arrest and imprisonment on August 27, his dramatic escape from Fort St. Angelo on October 8th, his trial in absentia in the oratory of the Decollato on November 27, and his final expulsion, also in absentia, also in the very same oratory on December 1. In that oratory, even though he was not there, his name was called out loudly, per una volta, una seconda volta, ed anco una terza volta. Loudness. This was part of ceremonial. It was the sound of the rite, the sensory experience of space, so that the vibrations caused on the wall would reach him wherever he was. Your demerits and unrighteousness have rendered you most unworthy to carry the sign of the true cross and habit of your order, of our order. We deprive you of your habit. We expel you. We remove you, crush you, and throw you away. In other words, he was thrown away, schiacciato, like a putrid and rotten member, ironically, in front of his own performative painting. Well, the reflections that we discussed today are the result of a repetitive, immersive relationship with the space and with a most humbling and profound work of art. Methodologically, it tries to do what Johannes Palasmas tells us, to embrace all the senses. It is also anchored in contextual archival research on the artist and on that particular space that have been conducted over the past 3 decades. In sum, and here I conclude, Caravaggio's beheading is in direct dialogue with the space and volume of the oratory, and it responds to the austerity of its early 17th century context. It provides an extension of the altar wall on which the scene is performed more than depicted. Directly in front of the audience, the painting was curated to take into account audience experience, the viewpoints, the manner in which light moved in the oratory, as well as the choreography of the rituals, the lifting of the wafer, the exposition of the hand, and the specific ceremonies performed in the space. It also took account of the artist's own life, of the celebration of the Eucharist, of warriors, of dying for religion, of prisoners on their way to their own execution, of knights at their investiture, and of knights at their expulsion. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Wow, 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 wow. I would like to thank our interpreters for their support this afternoon. Keith, we all want to become your students, so we're all flying to Malta on Monday. We'll figure out the accommodations, but really, thank you so much for this moving and brilliant discussion. And thank you all for being with us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. See you later.
Grazie.